Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome everyone to the Lawyering to Legalize It Right session. My name is Evan Smith. My pronouns are they, them, or he, him, and I am a community organizer at Marijuana Justice based here in Richmond, Virginia. Thank you all for being here today as we have two amazing guests here and two amazing presentations that'll be focused on marijuana legalization and how laws impact our communities. After each presentation, we will go over any questions that anyone has. Feel free to enter any of those in the chat, I believe, and we will get to those at the end of each presentation. Before we get into the presentations themselves, I'm going to introduce both of our guests today. We have Dawn Blagrove. Dawn is an attorney and activist who worked for close to a decade on behalf of incarcerated people at North Carolina Prisoner Legal Services. She now serves as executive director of Emancipate North Carolina, a community organization that works to dismantle structural racism and mass incarceration across the state. Emancipate North Carolina's focus areas include abolition, bail reform, ending youth confinement, police accountability, and restorative justice. We are very thankful to have Dawn here today. Secondly, my colleague, we have Chelsea Higgs-Wise. Chelsea is a mother, social worker, and a community organizer who firmly believes that there will be no peace without justice. Chelsea is the executive director and co-founder of Marijuana Justice, which is a Black-led platform that is rooted in historic storytelling, political education, and providing POC a space aimed at collective power that benefits us all. The organization was established to continue a movement of legalization centering on repairing the harms of the drug war. So we are so thankful to have both of these amazing people here to educate us and share their knowledge and experiences. I think we're going to start with Dawn first with your presentation, and then we'll get to Chelsea. And as I said earlier, please feel free to enter any questions or thoughts in the chat, and we will get to those in a Q&A after each individual presentation. Thanks so much.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here, and I'm going to jump right into our slides and my presentation. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. All right. Emancipate NC is an organization that is committed to ending systemic and institutional racism and abolishing mass incarceration. One of the most recent projects that we've taken on to try to stem the tide of mass incarceration is Don't Plead to We. So this campaign is designed, it's very simple, actually. It's really not very complicated at all. It is a campaign that is designed to help folks understand that weed is much less dangerous than alcohol, but it's criminalized in North Carolina because of racism and xenophobia. The smell of weed is an excuse for police to harass Black and brown people and search their cars. We are not your lawyers. Please consult with your lawyer about your case. So let's look at the numbers. In every single state, Black people were more likely to be arrested for marijuana possession than their counterparts, despite the fact that marijuana use is pretty much equal across all demographics and races. Over 300,000 people were arrested for weed charges in North Carolina annually, and the majority of those people are Black. So what this means is that, it's particularly in North Carolina, in our rural counties, what we are seeing is that marijuana arrests and convictions are the drivers of our folks into the carceral system. And what we know for sure is that once we get into the carceral system, it is virtually impossible to fully extricate yourself and to return yourself to your full citizenship status. Well, and that's a whole different conversation and a different debate. But being just as involved is problematic for Black and brown people for a multitude of reasons. We are disenfranchised. We are unable to find housing, unable to find solid economic basis. And what we have found is that in North Carolina and across the country, marijuana is very often the gateway into that criminal justice system. So we decided we should try to figure out a way to circumvent that and to be our own gatekeepers and to stop ourselves and keep us safe and keep Black folks out of the carceral system for things like marijuana. So what's the big picture? Here's the big picture. This campaign is called Don't Plead to Weed, and it is really that simple. In North Carolina, and probably in many other states across the country, the state crime lab cannot tell the difference between legal weed and illegal weed and legal hemp. Why? Because they are both cannabis. The state has to pay for a very expensive private lab test to prove the difference. What that means is the state doesn't have the money, North Carolina at least, doesn't have the money or the resources to invest in these very expensive private lab tests for every single marijuana possession charge. So ultimately what that means is the state cannot carry the burden of proof that what they have found or what they are claiming to be illegal marijuana is actually that. As a result, you should be pleading guilty to weed. Make them prove it. Now, we're going to get into some tips about ways that, that you can derail this along the way, and that you can be, and give you tips that you can use to make sure that you are protecting your own rights and protecting your own sovereignty. Why? Because we keep us safe. All right, so a real quick breakdown of cannabis. Cannabis is a plant, right, that grows naturally, that is broken down into two most important parts, CBD and THC. So CBD will not get you high. It is the stuff that's in weed. It is used for reduction of pain and inflammation. It can help ease nausea, migraine, seizures, and anxiety. THC, however, is the thing that gets you high, okay? And if you have too much THC in any cannabis that you own, that THC, that cannabis will be illegal. However, remember what I told you earlier, the state labs can't prove how much cannabis, or excuse me, how much THC is in anything without sending it out for a very expensive lab test. As a result, if you don't admit it, they can't prove it without spending a bunch of money. So what's the refrain that we're going to be saying over and over today, guys? Do not plead to weed. Don't plead to weed. All right, sorry. So what's the difference between hemp and marijuana? Hemp is cannabis that contains very little THC. Remember, that's the thing that gets you high. In its leaves and stalks and flowers. Less than 0.3% THC is the legal threshold. Okay. Marijuana, on the other hand, is a cannabis that contains much higher levels of THC, depending on how it's grown and how it's produced. But the bottom line is that anything that is less than 0.3% THC is legal. As a result, because the state cannot look at your marijuana, cannot look at your cannabis and determine whether it is hemp or marijuana, make them do the work. Don't do the work for them. Don't plead to weed. So here's a couple tips. Tip number one, protect your own rights. You have the right to remain silent. Don't admit to anything. Later on, I'm going to show you a wallet card, a digital wallet card that you can download and save it as a picture in your phone, so that if you are pulled over by the police and they are questioning you, you should pull up this digital wallet card and read it to them. Say what is on the card and nothing else. Why? Because the only way, especially as it comes to weed, that they will be able to prove that what you have is weed, what they smell is illegal cannabis, is if you tell them. So number one, be quiet. Don't say anything, right? Don't talk to the police. As a general rule, don't talk to the police, right? They pull you over, you let them ask you for what they want, you give them what they want, you be on your way. If they ask you to search your car, you say no. If they tell you that they are detaining you, you ask them, under what pretenses are you detaining me? May I leave? Once you are finished with that encounter, you should leave without speaking. Okay, you do not have to give them any information. You do not have to consent to them searching your car. You do not have to consent to anything when it comes to law enforcement. You have to show them your driver's license if you are the driver in North Carolina. But other than that, you answer their basic questions. Those should be yes, no, or I would prefer to answer that with an attorney present. Okay? Protect your own rights. If you tell the police officer when they pull you over and they ask you, is that weed I smell? And you say yes, don't plead to weed is done. It's out the window. Why? Because you've already admitted that what you have is an illegal substance. I want you to practice taking the word weed out of your vocabulary and replacing that word with cannabis. If you need to say it, but if you need to talk about your weed, if you need to talk about whatever it is that you have, do not call it weed, call it cannabis. Why? Because cannabis has the potential to be a legal substance. Therefore, it is not an admission of guilt if you even say that what you have been smoking or what you have or what they smell is cannabis. Now, remember, if you have gotten to that place, you talking too much. Protect your rights by not talking, remain silent. But if you cannot help yourself, which some of us cannot, right? Replace the word weed in your vocabulary with cannabis, because cannabis is not an admission of having an illegal substance. Number 2, make them prove it. You have the right to go to trial. Force the state to obtain a chemical analysis of the substance and prove beyond a reasonable doubt that it contains more than 0.3% THC. And they won't do it. And those charges will be dropped. Why? Because they can't prove it. Now, if you don't follow tip number 1, tip number 2 is not going to help you. Tip number 1 is what? Be quiet. Don't say anything. Don't admit to anything. Take the word weed out of your vocabulary. Replace it with cannabis. Replace it with hemp. Replace it with herbs. Anything but weed and marijuana, because those words will act as admissions, okay? But if you have followed the rules, if you have followed the tips, and you have not spoken to the police, and you have protected your own rights, by the time you get to trial, by the time you get to your attorney, you tell your attorney, I am not pleading to this charge. Why? Because I know that the state cannot prove, without spending a lot of money on a very expensive test, they cannot prove that what I have is illegal cannabis. Okay. Number 3, smell doesn't equal guilt. Hemp and marijuana look the same, have the same odor, burn the same. They appear the same, both burned and unburned. There is no way. So that means no drug dog can sniff and tell the difference between marijuana. Certainly, no police officer can smell the difference between hemp and marijuana. As a result, the only way that they will know that what you have is not legal hemp, excuse me, y'all, is if you tell them. Be going back to tip number 1, be quiet. Law enforcement should not be using the smell of marijuana or of hemp or burned cannabis as an excuse for reasonable doubt. Why? Because they can't tell whether or not what they are smelling is the result of legal hemp or illegal marijuana. As a result, it is not a ground for reasonable suspicion. Number 4, tip number 4, and this one is really important. Do what is best for you. Okay. In lots of counties in North Carolina, they have what is called a first-time misdemeanor diversion program, where you can do a couple hours of community service and the charge is dismissed once you complete that community service. If that is what is best for you, that is what you should do. Because ultimately, what Emancipate NC wants to do, and what the Don't Plead to Weed campaign is about, is minimizing the impacts and the touch of the justice system on you and on our community members. What that means is you do what is best for you. So you could fight this charge But if you have an opportunity where you don't have to fight it and the charge gets dismissed and doesn't stay on your record, by all means, do not feel like you have an obligation to fight the charge. You do not. If you have, what we want ultimately is for you not to end up with a conviction. So however you can go about doing that, you make that happen. Whatever is the road of least resistance, you do that. Also, if your lawyer pushes back and says to you that that you need to plead guilty to this charge, that you need to plead guilty to make it go away, I want you to direct your lawyers to the website don'tpleadtoweed.com, because there we will show them and give them the very special tools that they need to be able to really challenge a weed charge. Okay. Lastly, we want you to know your rights. So if you're stopped or pulled over by the police, you can pull up our digital card to remind you of your rights. Simply repeat what is on the card to protect your rights. And this is the card. I'm not going to read all the words because there's a lot of words, but I would like for everyone to visit the website, don'tpleadtoweed.com, download this wallet card, to keep it as a picture so that you can pull it up, add it to your favorites. So if and when you are pulled over by the police, you know exactly what words to say so that you are protecting your own rights and you are preserving your own freedom. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Dawn, for that. I just want to welcome anyone that has questions to put any in the chat, or if there's anyone in the physical room that has any questions, please let us know and we can hold some space for that. But I have one initial question as people are thinking of anything they want to ask. One question for you, Dawn. What kind of things or methods or strategies do the police use to try to kind of coerce or get people to actually say more information than they actually should when they have these interactions?
So here's the thing. One thing that my husband likes to say all the time is that the police can lie to you, but you cannot lie to the police. So the police can use just about any tactic that they want. What is important is that we, the people, understand the power that we have and understand the power of silence. So they can ask whatever questions they want, but you should remain silent. They can and be steadfast in this truth that they cannot prove that what they smell is illegal marijuana. And because they cannot prove what they smell is illegal marijuana, the only way for them to be able to convince a judge and to sustain a conviction for you against those marijuana charges is if you tell them. So it is imperative that you do not listen to them, right? You do not respond to them. You remain silent. Silence is your friend, and silence is a trump card that the police cannot overcome.
Thanks for that. Also, just kind of wanted to ask you, how would you kind of assess the current state of affairs in North Carolina as far as where the laws are, where they have been, where they're going? What's your level of optimism, if any? Just kind of curious as we see so many different parts of our country kind of go backwards, if not right now or in the near future.
So unfortunately, North Carolina is in the bucket of places that are probably going to go backwards. Just in this last legislative session, we were about to see the sunset of even hemp, that is cannabis with less than 3% THC, was going to no longer be protected under state law. We couldn't even get that bill passed. It had to be added back in. It had to be added into the budget omnibus bill in order to get it through. So ultimately, North Carolina hemp growers are still protected. And as a result, folks who indulge in hemp or the use of cannabis are also protected by some of these same laws. But I think that it is indicative of the state of North Carolina that our General Assembly was even hesitant to protect hemp growers who are vastly white folks, right? Vastly people that are like them, not people that look like us and look like ours. So if that is any indicator, I think it's clear that nowhere in our future will we see, or at least in our our immediate future, will we see cannabis be legalized fully here in North Carolina. But it doesn't have to be. And this is what We Keep Us Safe is all about, right? And what Don't Bleed to Weed is all about. We have the power to use the law in the way that they use it, right? If we know it and understand it, we can use it. If we know that they can't prove it and they have the burden of the proof, we just have to be quiet and not plead to weed.
I'm gonna ask one more question, and if anyone else has any questions, feel free to let us know. But also just want to give you the opportunity to share any information about Emancipate North Carolina, and how can people support the work that you all do? And are there any things coming up in the near future that people can kind of get tapped into or be aware of?
So Emancipate NC is doing really the work of the people. We are an organization that is always going to be on the ground. We are fighting, along with fighting to reduce mass incarceration. We are also doing impact litigation as it relates to police accountability. We are doing trainings all over the community. We are doing legislative advocacy. If you want to be up to date and up to speed on what we're doing, I would encourage everyone to visit our website, emancipatenc.org, and sign up for our newsletters that are come out bi-monthly. Additionally, you can follow us on Instagram and Twitter and Facebook. Emancipatenc.org is our handle across all of the social media platforms, where we will keep you up to date on what is happening in North Carolina, and also on the work that we're doing.
Awesome, thanks so much. Haven't seen any questions from anyone else come through, so for now, I'm going to prepare to share my own screen for Chelsea's presentation, but if anything comes up in the meantime, still feel free to put that in the chat or let us know, and we'll try to get to those after Chelsea's presentation. So give me 1 second to share my screen, and then we will get connected to the next presentation.
All right. While Evan is just opening that up, I will go ahead and introduce myself. And I'm going to attempt to speak slowly for the interpreter as well. And my name is Chelsea Higgs Wise, and I am the executive director and one of the co-founders of Marijuana Justice. Evan gave a great introduction earlier. And I'm also a local organizer and former social worker that worked with Medicaid recipients for over 10 years prior to diving into a more macro community organizing space. And Don, I think your volume's still on, just giving you a bit heads up. So while I start this presentation, I'm going to just go ahead and let everyone know what the purpose of my presentation is: to produce this case study of movement lawyers supporting individuals and grassroots organizations to center those most harmed by the enforcement of marijuana prohibition. So I am really coming and showing up to this space today as an organizer that is sharing my experience working with movement lawyers. Next slide, Evan. And a big shout out to Evan too, by the way, for moderating this and supporting me with this slideshow in this very technical world that we all live in now. My first real testimony I want to bring to this presentation is the power of coalitions. As I mentioned, we are a grassroots organizing organization, and it really has been the power of coalition work that has brought the major wins that we can claim to have in Virginia. And so I want to really lift our coalition partners, Rise for Youth. Valerie Slater is the executive director there who works with us, and she's also one of my co-chairs of the coalition. A Black woman and a lawyer that works specifically to keep youth out of prisons, jails, and detention centers. Their work has been so important to us as we look to legalize and decriminalize, specifically as we look at some of the numbers and who is targeted in this prohibition and the enforcement, specifically young people, young Black people. We also work with Virginia Student Power Network, and they are an organization that supports multiple campuses across the Commonwealth of Virginia. And it is important to us to be in coalition with young people because, again, as we will see in the numbers in just a little bit, at who is impacted. And we know that in Virginia, prior to the legalization of simple possession, that the majority, over 50% of the possession arrests were to Black people between the age of 18 and 24. That is a huge number of disparities and the majority there. And we understand that 18 to 24 is also the college age. And so it's important to us to work with college age people, particularly as well. Virginia Student Power Network works to lower the enforcement penalties as well within their schools and the enforcement strategies and surveillance. Most college campuses have a zero tolerance policy, even in legal states, because of federal funding. And so it is important to engage young people and people on college campuses, especially if they are living on college campuses, because that means that marijuana and cannabis is still prohibited in their living quarters. And as we know and have heard, particularly also from Dawn's presentation, that marijuana, hemp, cannabis is used in many ways, and as well as medicinal. And in Virginia, medicinal cannabis is legal. So we are really supporting the different spaces where, even in a quote unquote legal state, where certain spaces are still feeling the enforcement the most, and who those people are that take up that space. Finally, in our coalition, I really want to lift Justice Forward Virginia for this day and this audience of Lawyering for Liberation. We have come into this and we understood that to change the law and to be heard by many legislators, particularly in Virginia, that we do claim to be the South, there has to be certain voices there with us, and folks with legal backgrounds, lawyers, and particularly public defenders that make up Justice Forward Virginia. They have proved to be vital in the way that they show up for us and their work around other issues that have helped us to legalize it right, and to move forward as a coalition. We have been working together since 2020 in January. In Virginia, our sessions run normally from January to April or so. And so in January 2020, pre-COVID and pre-rising global uprisings for Black lives, is when we really surfaced in the Commonwealth, Virginia, to say that we need to legalize it right. Next slide. So when we decided to show up with our Legalize It Right campaign, it was really showing the problem in Virginia with marijuana prohibition. And movement lawyers really helped us do this. As you will see, that this is a report from ACLU, the National ACLU, and this allowed us to see that ACLU had a background in marijuana legalization and decriminalization. And even prior to this report coming out, this report came out that shows all states data in 2020 of April. But even prior to that, ACLU has been putting out reports. And so we went to our local ACLU and they helped us bring these numbers to the forefront to show, number one, our legislators the problem, but more importantly, to help support grassroots organizers and individuals impacted, that they weren't crazy, that the impact of this enforcement was real. That if you were Black and young in Virginia, if you felt like the cops were on your back about marijuana and weed, you were probably right to feel that way. And that's what the numbers do to help justify and validate our stories that should not need validation, but particularly the further we go with conservative thinking that criminal justice is related to public safety and law enforcement funding, we have to really come in to show our reality of what the impacts of this enforcement means. So in Virginia, this was in 2028. I'm sorry, 2018. We were ranked actually 27th in the nation for racial disparities. 4 out of the top 20 counties with the highest racial disparities in the United States were housed right here in Virginia. From 2010 to 2018, Virginia matched the national trend that increased the possession arrests that's still happening to this day. And our increase topped 33.1% over that 8 years, which means in 2018 alone, Virginia prosecuted over 46,000 people for weed. And that number, particularly here in ACLU, but also in our data in Virginia, that Black people were 3.5 times more likely to be arrested than white residents in Virginia for possessing marijuana. So with this information that we had forward, we were able to start our Legalize It Right campaign, like I mentioned, in 2020. But Virginia legislators were already dead set on decriminalizing possession. This was 2020. And we showed up with our repeal the prohibition language. And we say the word repeal because it's going to be important that we repeal all of the enforcements of marijuana as much as we can. And yes, I usually start out by saying the reason why we are still using the word marijuana is because, number one, as Dawn mentioned, it is more criminalized than hemp. We see the same thing in Virginia, that most people involved in hemp and are shown are white people. And number two, because actually in the criminal code here in Virginia and in our federal code, it is the word marijuana that is criminalized and penalized. And to be very honest, it's the word that a lot of our people know right now. People are still using and learning the word cannabis, just as we saw in Dawn's presentation. It is a new way of talking, thinking, and now we're saying a new way of enforcement. So in 2020, we decided to decriminalize. I see we have a quick break and interpreters. Oh, we have a new one. Okay, great. I was just catching up for you all. So in 2020, Virginia decided to decriminalize. The word decriminalization means zero criminalization. But what it means in policy across the nation, including here in Virginia, is that it means no longer going to criminal court. But there still is a civil court. That civil court means that this is now an economic disadvantage for those same people that have been targeted by these laws when it was criminal court, right? The police are still not acting any differently to approach people. It still invites police interaction because it is still against the law. And so this 2020 decriminalization that was posed and passed was something that we did not outright support, because we knew that it would still come back with targeting our people with impacts that were unfair and would create collateral consequences, specifically around housing, employment, education, financial aid, and marijuana is also the number 4 reason for deportation. So when we're looking and talking to movement lawyers about the first steps in your area, yes, we want to talk about decriminalization, and often we get held up about the threshold, but it really is about making sure that when we're having this first step, we talk about repealing the prohibition of at least simple possession, and then looking around to say what would make the most sense for other thresholds around misdemeanors and felonies that can bring the less harm, and also make sense around the way that people buy and consume cannabis, right? So next slide. So knowing that they were passing decriminalization, we worked with lawyers and movement lawyers to come up with a study that we could propose if we knew that they were going to pass in 2020 a bill to decriminalize, because we knew the impacts would still hurt our people, right? And this is really what we call people-centered policy making, right? We're not just thinking about, well, what looks the best in policy or the least restrictive, but what feels less for the people. And that's why we wanted to create more ways to understand how the data is going to show up to show our experience. And in the 2020 session, even though decriminalization was going through, we also proposed a consideration for marijuana legalization study that included language very specifically around equity, around expungements, around regulations, as well as possession. We were excited because it was Senator McClellan, a Black woman, that was able to pick this study up and get it passed somewhat at the last minute. And Evan asked a question earlier about tactics that law enforcement uses. Well, a tactic that many of us are used to seeing and experiencing through legislators is the idea of a work group being put together to create bills that are just from people in Virginia. That may work for certain issues, a work group with local people putting it together. Or when I say local, I normally mean people that are appointed, legislators, folks that are also not connected with the community. But what we wanted is we wanted to not just have a work group that only had legislators and corporate cannabis people on it, because they were not allowing any civil rights groups, no lawyers on there, any of our lawyers that we wanted to put on the work group. And we had to then go and find someone that would allow us to put in a resolution to have a study done through the Joint Legislative Audit and Review Commission. Okay, this is a body that does research for the legislators, for the Virginia Assembly. And we know it's really important whose research we are producing when we're talking to certain legislators. So we got their own body to do this research. In the proposal, legislators also tried to get this study done through another body called the Crime Commission. That was not something that we wanted, even though there were lawyers on that crime commission, there were cops on that crime commission. It was very public safety criminal people. And we did not want this data to come out of there. So it was also strategic about what body did this research so that we could help to make sure that the outcome and deliverable was the most equitable that spoke to our experience. This report did pass, thank goodness. And in November of 2020, we have now lived through a few months of COVID. We have seen the global uprising for Black lives. And now Virginia, the same people that told me, Chelsea, there's no reason to have this big study done. We're not going to legalize it for at least 5 to 10 years. Well, after COVID and after the uprising for Black lives in November of 2020, the then governor, Ralph Northam, announced that Virginia was ready to legalize cannabis and marijuana for adult use of 21 and older. But what he said was he wanted to legalize it by 2024, and yet still with the priority of equity. So now we are about to enter that January 2021 session that is mostly virtual, by the way. And we are saying that Virginia may legalize in 2024, 3 years later. But they want to say they're doing it with equity. Next slide. As we enter in this session, we see that they do not want to legalize this, at least decriminalize, at least repeal the enforcement earlier than another 3 years, than 2024. So our coalition, with the help of Justice Forward, the movement lawyers, and public defenders, actually do a FOIA request to support our coalition, and got the information of how the new decriminalization of marijuana had been enforced. So to let everyone know, in that 2020 decriminalization bill, it stated that up to 1 ounce of marijuana was now decriminalized and only a $25 ticket. So we put in the FOIA request and asked, well, who is still getting penalized, because we do collect that by race, and what did the numbers look like? So then our local NPR station picked up our press release about the numbers that were not shocking to us, because this is what we had said with the decriminalization, but the racial disparities persisted after marijuana decriminalization. As you remember, that from the ACLU report, prior to decriminalization, Virginia's rates of enforcement for Black people were 3.5 times the rate of white people. What we saw after decriminalization, just 6 months in, because our law took effect that July 1 of 2020, we saw that the people that were feeling the decriminalization penalty of $25 were Black people 4 times the rate of white people. I'll say that one more time, that the decriminalization laws were being enforced to Black people 4 times the rate as white people. This was actually a slight increase to the racial disparity proportions prior to decriminalization. So I wanted to bring up this point about decriminalization, but also the power of coalitions. Of this article, and the press and journalists did not come up with this on their own. We had to actually find the information during the session, because we saw that legislators were not going to move on that 2024 date. And we said, well, this is just 6 months after decriminalization. Off the top of my head, I believe that it was about 1,500 people that had gotten impacted over the 6 months. And so adding that for 3 more years, how many more people? Those are thousands of people that will continue to be penalized for a $25 ticket. And if we need to contextualize more about what it is living in a pandemic and the beginning of 2021 prior to vaccines, a $25 ticket is something that could make or break a lot of families. I want to also lift what was happening in other movement lawyers that came in to support our actions around legalization, and why movement lawyers across issues can really support the Legalize It Right movement. In the summer of 2020, with decriminalization still, I was receiving phone call after phone call from housing lawyers that said, Chelsea, because of the pandemic, landlords now are using our terrible Landlord Tenant Act in Virginia to evict people because of past marijuana possession offenses on their record. Now, these folks had been living in these households for years. Landlord knew about these offenses on their record, but because of Virginia's code around landlords and tenants, landlords still had the right to evict people. So they were using a pandemic, a health crisis, to evict people to help with gentrification, to help with certain loans. But what we saw there too is that we also needed to talk about the protections and what it meant for people that were still being penalized through small amounts of marijuana. And these types of stories, as well as the stories around decriminalization with the numbers, and I'll just say one other tad bit. Right here in Richmond, Virginia, the local public housing authority was sued by movement lawyers for that case of evicting a woman because of a past marijuana possession charge. Because she had lived there for a long time, attempting to make precedent and to spread the word. So these are ways that lawyers can come in and support grassroots organizers that are really attempting to legalize it right. So in the middle of 2021, we saw these numbers and we knew that we were in the middle of session and we were going to pass something about legalization, but our response was to say data and demands. Next slide. So the next demand that we saw and was to show the data and to legalize it right. So we held a webinar because we are still very much in COVID, but it was one of the largest webinars we had ever had. And we worked with ACLU Virginia at the time to help host this webinar, as well as host a petition that circulated and was ACLU's largest petition of that session. This is prior to marijuana justice having any funding, by the way. So it, again, why coalition power is so crucial, because of the way that other organizations can come in and lift these messages. So we had this panel that had legislators, it had advocates, it had organizers and people. And we called this the nudge for Northam to legalize it right. Ralph Northam was our governor at the time. And by this time in March, when we held this session, the House and the Senate had already passed a legalization bill for 2024. And we were circulating the information from Decrim, journalists were picking it up. And because our movement journalists had been working with movement lawyers that had been working with movement here, we were able to strategically make sure that there were very little public or positive headlines about the legalization, because it took 3 years to stop the predatory policing of possession. And because this nudge for Northam happened and the press was telling the people and we were organizing and movement lawyers were coming together to talk about the enforcement of marijuana is not keeping us safe and their own experiences defending clients, Governor Northam actually amended that bill to repeal the simple possession, repeal the prohibition of the simple possession of marijuana in Virginia, making us the first state in the South, yes, we are the South, to do so. We can argue about the South later. Next slide. Okay, I really also want to take a couple slides and very quickly go over Justice Forward Virginia, their movement, their focus that was happening at the same time that really allowed us to come together to work in coalition. Again, Justice Forward is a group of volunteer public defenders and our movement lawyers here in Virginia that we work with directly. they were able to propose in the 2020 session a banning of pretextual stops. This wasn't the 2020 session of DCRIM. This was actually a 2020 special session that happened particularly because of the uprising for Black lives. This session was called for policing specifically, and Justice Ford was able to pass this package of banning pretextual stops. This bill also included a new law that would collect data from this type of enforcement moving forward to ensure that we were capturing race and we're bringing evidence-informed data to policy members. Next slide. Real quickly, the pretextual stops, and to go over that really quickly. If a person is stopped for one of these reasons, evidence discovered will be inadmissible in Virginia because of the new banning of pretextual stops. This is defective equipment that includes tail lights, license plate lights that are out and defective, brake lights that are defective, and dangling objects, including loud exhaust, a dark window tint, expired registration or state inspection, pedestrian in the roadway, and of course, the smell of marijuana. You know, they really understood that only talking about weed to some of our legislators was just never going to allow them to listen. So they took the approach of keeping drivers safe and what they knew of Black drivers safe and how they could do that, as well as add to the movement of the decriminalization and the legalize it right that was happening with the community. Next slide. I'm going to allow this to play. This is a video that was produced by Justice Forward Virginia during their campaign. And we're going to see if we can get that to play. And if not, and Evan, since you're sharing your screen, you might have to come off mute if you can get it to play. Can you go over the, no, okay.
I don't think it's doing anything for me.
That's okay. We can go to the next one, and we'll make sure that any information that you need is given to the conference if you're interested. You can definitely also reach out and visit Justice Forward Virginia, their website, and their information is on our Canna Justice website. So we always are connecting to them, and they're pretty easy to find from any of our platforms. That video, though, really does just highlight some ways that, again, these pretextual stops are other gateways to policing certain types of people, and how certain folks are probably not being pulled over or stopped or need a lawyer for things like something dangling from their rear view mirror. And these are public defenders talking about, you know, who they've had to defend and why, as well as community members that are telling their stories. We are really excited that that passed. And so as we move forward with a ban on pretextual stops, as well as the repeal of repeal of the prohibition of simple possession, we are now in the world of protecting progress. As Dawn mentioned before, many places, and I'd like to just say many places, particularly in the South, are going backwards with this current political context and where we are. So currently, we just finished a session as well. In July 1 of 2022, we had new marijuana possession laws come out, unfortunately, because a new administration, more conservative, Governor Glenn Youngkin, who is a Republican, as well as our House is now fully Republican. So we have a very different legislative context in Virginia this past session, which means we did have some losses. And unfortunately, prior to this new year in July 1, we had a complete legalization of possession up to 1 ounce. And then from 1 ounce to 1 pound, was a civil penalty of $25. Well, starting July 1, right here in Virginia, unfortunately, it's from 1 ounce to now 4 ounces is only a $25 ticket. And now from 4 ounces to 1 pound is a class 3 misdemeanor. Subsequent offenses is actually a class 2 misdemeanor that opens up a larger fine and possible jail time. We also have to note that this past session, they attacked the pretextual stops ban. We are very fortunate it did not pass, but only because we held it down in the Senate. But we know we're going to have to continue to protect that. And then as well as moving forward, as Virginia looks at regulating adult use cannabis fully, what type of enforcement comes and where are the revenues going? Some states that were not legal states may not have known that in 2020, for the uprising of Black Lives, the latest uprising for Black Lives, that many cannabis Black organizers were stating and uncovering that many of the revenues to the sale of marijuana were going back to the police, to bonuses, to funding, not towards the community. And many of these funds were just used in a way that were not for us. So continuing to look at how we can protect our community in Virginia as we move forward with legalizing it right. Next slide. Update on our resentencing and release. Virginia has still not done any type of resentencing nor releasing of people with marijuana offenses, even though we have stated that we are going to regulate the adult use sale as well as repeal the prohibition of simple possession. We know that in Virginia alone, we have at least 599 people, almost 600 people that are still incarcerated for marijuana offenses in Virginia. That does not cover local jails. That's only the state DOC. This also does not cover those with ankle monitors and community supervision. Next slide. And if I could also just take a note that we are in desperate need of movement lawyers for the resentencing and release space. If you visit marijuanajustice.org in our education, you can see some of the best practices or opportunities for resentencing. Many folks focus on the expungement, but we cannot leave behind the people that are still incarcerated in cages for cannabis. And working out how that looks in each state is going to be very specific and homegrown, if you will. And in Virginia, they attempted to do this through our parole board in our more conservative political landscape. Going through our parole board is like basically saying they're not serious about resentencing and releasing. It did offer an opportunity, but this is why we need lawyers and movement lawyers dedicated to working with us to bring out what are the opportunities for the most expansive release and resentencing that makes the most sense to return us home to our families as soon as possible. Finally, I'm sorry, go back, Evan, yep. So finally, Legalize It Right continued. Where else do we need to look that is on our radar? But we would love support always from movement lawyers, and they don't have to be in Virginia. We've had help, particularly through We the Action, that is a nonprofit for volunteer lawyers that have helped with many of these campaigns that I've mentioned. Legalize It Right continued. We are still looking to repeal the family regulation agencies. I was a former social worker, which means I understand that as the home cultivation is enforced, that who that will be means it will be those that have cops in their homes. And those are people, particularly with under family regulation surveillance, those in DSS and Child Protective Services, and how the drug war is still used in those spaces to separate families and break up our legacy, as well as land and climate protections and allocation. Who gets to grow this? Who gets to sell this? We know that cannabis is a very thirsty crop. So what does that mean? There's also a lot of indoor grow that's happening. So what does that mean for electricity and utility? So getting lawyers and protections there. Also immigration enforcement, getting information out to those with different documentation status about what being in a legal state means to them, even though it is still federally illegal. We also need movement lawyers and support and regulation evaluation. Cannabis industry and enforcement is changing every day as laws are changing across the country. So ensuring that those are done with evaluations to show the impact of those new laws and getting that information out to other movement lawyers and organizers so that that information can inform us in our work. And of course, juvenile enforcement. Yes, we understand that legalization will be for 21 and up, but that means that the most enforcement and criminalization will come to young people, right? And we really are looking at marijuana legalization as a gateway to dismantling the entire drug war, not just with cannabis. And so we are really looking at slowly dismantling all of the enforcement and penalties in people's lives, because we know that criminalization period is a public health issue. Next slide. I don't know if there are any questions. This would be a great time for questions for myself or for Dawn. But while we'll wait for that, I would like to go one more slide, Evan. Don't cut me out. Don't keep sharing it. One more thing. I was hoping to share our last slide about our information and how to get in touch with us and follow us. All of our social media is at THC Justice Now. And we are on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. And you can email us with any questions at info@marijuanajustice.org. And you can just go straight to our website to go to marijuanajustice.org. And there you can find our YouTube page where you can subscribe. You can subscribe to our email list and get an email from Evan every single week with updates of what's going on. And just know that many of our conversation, our monthly conversation, as well as our conference that we just had with our Canna Justice Coalition, all of those sessions that happened last December are on our YouTube channel. I'd also like to encourage everyone to also save the date. In December, we're going to have our second annual Canna Justice Conference. And that information is at cannajustice.org, but you can also get to from our page. All right, Evan, now I'm done.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Chelsea, for that presentation. I got a note during the presentation that if anyone has questions, they can actually email me. One of the organizers connected with me. So if you have any questions for Chelsea or Dawn, you can email me directly. It's my first name, Evan, EVAN, at marijuanajustice.org. So I'm gonna ask Chelsea a few questions, but I will check my email throughout to see if anyone else has something to share. To start, Chelsea, just kind of wanted to get your thoughts and perspectives. I think a lot of people, when it comes to the work that we do, frame it from a binary lens of Democrat versus Republican. And I think we know much better that both parties, both sides have had an integral role in harming our communities. But I'm also kind of curious to hear how you feel any other entities that exist, the large operators, the organizations that are advocating in these meetings that we watch during the General Assembly. How do you see their role impacting this work, and how some organizations will be very intentional in who they involve in their ranks to spread their information throughout the community?
Thank you for that question, particularly about corporations and who we talk about multi-state operators. Multi-state operators are our large corporations, and those are our big lobbyists that we are basically fighting against. They are focused on capitalism, on profit, And we know that when folks are focused on those lenses, that does not equal justice or liberation for our people. And so it's also really important that we have lawyers for that understand corporate law, that also understand small businesses, that understand workers and employment law, as well as that can help us go through this budget. Because once the revenues come in from selling, where they're going, and are they going back to giving corporate coupons to build more big dispensaries? So it's important for us to continue to look at the regulations and what that means for other entities, particularly institutions and corporations, because they have money, they have political influence, and they can meet the instant need of that instant gratification of give me my weed, give me it now, which a lot of people show up to this work with, of just to legalize it sense. Just legalize it. I want my hands on it. I want to get the fun ways to consume it. When we are here to say legalize it right.
Thanks so much for that. Similar question. I just got a question, but let me ask you another question before I look at this email. Similar question to what I asked Dawn earlier. Where do you see kind of the current state of affairs in Virginia right now, and the outlook for things in this year and years to come? You made a good point talking about the history of legalization and what happened when Governor Northam was in office, and now we have Governor Youngkin, and we know how the rest of our elected representatives are. So just kind of curious to hear what you think Virginia will be doing in the near future, or do you feel like it's just too early to tell and it's a lot of messiness that needs to be figured out?
So I think the outlook is depending on the people, and there's depending on how we show up in many different places in many different spaces. And we have to always remember that Virginia is part of the larger movement here, and why we can look at what's happening nationwide, globally, and also predict here in Virginia. I will say too that we got some progress with the Democrats, but as folks heard, it was hard. And I will say that we also had to bring up Governor Northam's yearbook picture that showed him in either a blackface get up or a Klan outfit, supposedly. And through that horrible time and very embarrassing time to him, we hope, at least, we were able to use that leverage to get more. So as we look at, even as you mentioned before, Democrat, Republican, it really depends on the moment and the power that the people want to show up and push with. So I'm always trying to stay positive with the power of the people.
We have a question from Danielle, who is asking, how would people in another Southern state connect with you all in bringing work like this to our community? I live and work in Harris County in Houston, Texas, and am a part of a legalization group there as well. So maybe I know, Chelsea, we talked a little bit about how to connect with marijuana justice, but any thoughts on that? And maybe after you, Dawn, if you have any thoughts as well to that question.
Great. Thank you for that question. Yes, we would love to connect to you. We can also email you back specifically, but if there are folks that would like to invite us to talk to your group, that is something that is very dear to our heart, specifically those in the South. We did not bring it up today, but locally, like municipal work versus statewide work, and how you can really do a lot of change minds and hearts, which can lead to policy at the local work. And even some resolutions that can say, hey, if we legalize it this way, then the money that the locality gets needs to go here, right? So you can start putting that in people's minds and start coming with those demands. So when I know, marijuana justice shows up to groups like that, we come share our ideas, but then say, hey, how can your demands fit into certain tactics that can work for your place, space, and time? Dawn, you have something?
Sure. we are also here at Emancipate NC. We are also always, I mean, one of the things that the pandemic taught us is that Zoom can bring us all together, right? So we are more than happy to do virtual trainings with your folks or in your communities around around this particular campaign, which is Don't Plead to Weed, but any of the other campaigns that we do. We believe very strongly that in the power of the people, right? And we believe that, and this campaign specifically is being launched in one of our rural counties here in North Carolina, where we have an organizer, because we can look at the numbers of charges and know that folks are being disproportionately impacted. Black and brown people are being disproportionately impacted by marijuana charges. And because the population is so small, and so often in these rural communities, we are leaving so much power on the table, right? And if we galvanize that power in those small rural communities, we can really create a paradigm shift throughout the entire state. So we are more than happy to talk to your organizations via Zoom or whatever the case may be, and share with you some of our best practices, some of the things that have worked, some of the things that haven't worked. And hopefully that can be reciprocated and you all can share with us, because here's the truth of the matter. Together, we're stronger, and together we win. And when we're thinking and organizing collectively on a larger scale throughout the diaspora, everybody wins. So we are always happy to collaborate, sis, always.
Awesome. If anyone else has any questions, just as a reminder, you can email me, Evan, EVAN, at marijuanajustice.org. To ask another question, and some of the time that we have left, kind of wanted to just get both of our guests' thoughts on what trajectory have you all individually been on to get to this point as executive directors? What has informed y'all's ability to learn and your experiences and to be able to lead organizations like this? And what are kind of your goals and hopes for the future for each of your individual organizations?
Yeah, I can go.
Yeah.
How did I get here? Great question. I was a social worker. I'm a mom. I'm a child of folks that have survived the drug war and met and seen many of my family members behind bars for nonviolent drug offenses. The state is violent, by the way. Then I became a radio show host and saw the movement happening. Then we had Blackface History Month with the Governor's Yearbook, and we were protesting, and people are like, well, how do we make a policy change? This was also in 2019, the 400th year of Africans really first, that was not true, but when Africans were trafficked to Virginia shores, right here to our shores. And so it was a lot going on in 2019, and people wanted something to say, get us free and bring money to our communities. So that's how we showed up to marijuana justice, is because we've always been racial justice organizers, and the people wanted a policy means that would bring harm reduction and police enforcement, as well as revenue to their communities.
So I was raised in a very Black nationalist home. I grew up in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. So I, as a child, wanted to be a revolutionary when I grew up. But I also grew up in a very middle class home, so I wasn't quite sure how revolutionaries went on vacation because I couldn't figure out how they made money. So around 12 years old, I decided I saw a documentary about the Chicago 7, and I was like, ooh, they got a revolutionary lawyer. I'm going to be a revolutionary lawyer, and I bet you they can go to Disney World. So, well, and obviously that's not true, but that's neither here nor there. So I decided to be a revolutionary lawyer, and that is what I've done. I am married, 2 children, been married 24 years now, 24, that's right. And had my girls, so went to law school as a full grown adult. You can do it. It can happen. 2 children and a husband. It's actually a lot easier than you think. So don't dismiss the idea of going back to school, because we need more revolutionary lawyers. I came out of school. I worked for an organization called North Carolina Prisoners Legal Services, where I represented, along with about 10 other people, other attorneys, the 37 or so thousand incarcerated people in North Carolina on post-conviction motions. I did that for almost 10 years until I burnt completely out. And then this opportunity kind of opened itself up where I could make systemic change. I mean, I think it's important to understand, like, you know, Chelsea was saying, as a social worker, she was inside the system. She knows what it looks like. She was working with that system on a granular level, and she could see the harm that the system caused. But I thought it was also important to be able to transition that granular knowledge about the harms of the system to a more holistic advocacy approach, right? To try to make systemic changes in ways that was actually informed by the work that we did on that granular level, right? That do work. And what I found when I came into that realm was that not very many people who were doing advocacy work knew anything about how the system actually worked, which was crazy to me, kind of mind blowing. And so I bring that to the table. Emancipate brings that to the table. We are also deeply committed to bringing to the table the people who are most directly impacted. We have a third of our staff is directly impacted folks. One of our primary organizer and policy director, Kerwin Pittman, did 11 years in prison, went in at 19. He's only been out about 4 years, and he is like setting the world on fire with his desire to transform, and also with his very, very deeply informed understanding of what it means to live in a cage, what it means to be in solitary confinement. And, you know, our organization is committed to using the voices of people who have real lived experiences, coupled with the Dan Freemans, like myself. If you don't know who Dan Freeman is, it's a book that changed my life. The Spook Who Sat by the Door. I won't even go into it, but if you've never read it, you need to read it. It's about using our privilege as Black folks, Black middle class folks, to create real revolutionary change in our own communities, and using the privilege that we have and the access that we have to make sure that the folks who don't have that privilege and that access have the tools that they need to create real revolutionary change in their community. So I'm going to stop there.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Dawn. We're almost at 4 p.m. and we know people have sessions after this. So I want to give people space to kind of decompress and think on what has been said to this point. Before we head off, I also just want to thank our interpreters for their contributions to making this session more accessible. So thanks so much to Samantha and Tanya for giving that help there. We want to always make sure that this education, this information can be understood by all people, and make sure we keep our community safe, as we've said throughout this entire session. Please, thanks everyone for attending this. Thank you so much for the organizers of the conference. We're really excited to be here and to share this information. And please do not hesitate to contact any of us hereafter. Let this session be a jumping off point for future interactions and collaborations, and we can work in solidarity to make sure that we legalize it right. So thanks so much for everyone attending, and hope you have a great rest of your day. Goodbye.